introduce myself. My name is Matthew Clementi. I teach at Boston College, teach philosophy, and I'm very honored to be a part of the Psychological Humanities and Ethics lecture series. It's been a great privilege to be a part of this group, and I'm very excited to be introducing Simon tonight. So, sorry, Simon, we accidentally let everyone in as you walked out. So,
all right,
I'm just getting started.
okay.
Timing is always great with these things. So, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. I was saying to Simon before you entered, I think, what a privilege and honor it is to have him joining us tonight. He's a thinker who I've admired for many years, and I know that there's a lot that we'll gain, a lot of insight that we'll learn from our engagement tonight. The name of his talk is Notes on Suicide, and it will be coming from a book which has recently been reissued. Notes on Suicide is an absolutely beautiful book that will be available in the US on November 24th. But actually, I was telling Simon, you can order it now. It takes a little while for them to ship it from the UK, but I got my copy, so already available if you want to order it straight through the press. Tonight, I'll go through a little bit of the structure of how tonight's going to go, and then I'll introduce Simon and we'll get underway. So first, I want to talk a little bit about the series. The Psychological Humanities and Ethics lecture series here at the Lynch School of Education and Human Development at Boston College is a series that seeks to bring together thinkers, writers, to bring engagement, particularly to psychology, but to the broader humanities, to bring together thinkers who are interested in questions of meaning, suffering, human finitude, the essential aspects of human life, and to bring kind of more investment and engagement around these questions and about what it means to think ethically around these questions. I know that many of my colleagues from psychology in this group talk about feeling that at times there's an impoverishment in psychological circles, lack of discussion of how ethics should be shaping and forming how we think about psychology. And I know for myself as a philosopher, a lot of times one of the things that I struggle with as a philosopher is, you can get caught up in the weeds and in the minutiae and in the academic ideas of things and lose sight of the really concrete human elements of our experience and how to think and talk through those things and be in dialogue with others who are approaching similar questions, maybe in different ways, but how those dialogues and conversations can open us up to new horizons and new understandings of what it means to be a human being in relation to other people. Now, this group began really out of the every other year Psychology and the Other conference, which is now hosted here at Boston College. And there's been so much success in that conference, bringing together philosophers, psychologists, clinicians, theologians, people from a diverse array of fields and backgrounds, but coming together and talking about these issues, that we hope this lecture series will help us to be able to sustain a lot of that energy and excitement that goes into the conference every 2 years and kind of bring it more to the forefront and give a lot more people access to these types of topics and conversations over the course of the whole year. So I would say stay tuned. There are a whole bunch more of these lectures that we'll be doing over the course of this year, and would obviously love to have you engaging with them. The way that tonight will proceed is that Simon will talk, he'll share his screen, which he's going to be going through a lot of his ideas. I'll offer a response to his talk when he's finished, and then we'll open up to a question and answer session where you can write your questions in, and we'll be going through and trying to pick out a lot of the themes that are really highlighted throughout the questions and kind of engage with Simon on that. I'll give a brief introduction to Simon and his work and kind of what it means. I was having a conversation a few months back, actually, before we even approached Simon to do this, with a friend of mine who is in the English department at one of the SUNY schools. And I was saying to him, I really wish that there were more philosophers who cared about being kind of public intellectuals, speak on anything, who are kind of engaged in the current matters, but also the matters that are really at the core of human life. And the first thing he said to me is Simon Critchley. And I mean, this just speaks to the relevance and the import of Simon's work. Simon's work is something that really goes to the heart of the human condition. and touches on the really kind of vital, fundamental matters of ethics, politics, religion, but then I would say even the vital matters of, he has a great book on football and what it means to think about sport. And those are matters that are so meaningful for our lives and that we don't often bring into kind of intellectual discussion, but that I think are really the heart of what it is to be a human being. So it's always a great pleasure to read his work. Reading this book in anticipation for tonight was really just a really wonderful experience. So I would encourage you to check the book out. Also, I recently read, I'll plug another one of your books, Simon, another recent work by him, which is Tragedy, the Greeks and Us. And if you have an interest in ancient philosophy or in Greek tragedy, I would say this is a work that you absolutely should check out. Simon is a prolific author and really just a diverse and incredible thinker and human being. And I'm very eager to be able to listen to him tonight and engage with him. So without further ado, Simon, take it away.
Great introduction. Thank you very much, Matthew. That was very, very kind of you. And nice to be back in Boston. In Boston College, and I've been there. But the psychology and the other conference used to be somewhere else, right? It wasn't at BC, was it? Wasn't it somewhere in?
It was at Lesley. Last cycle it came to Boston College, and now Boston College through the Lynch School is its official home.
Okay, well, good for BC, and thank you for the kind introduction. And I can't see you, but nice to see you, not being able to see you properly. So what am I going to do tonight? I am going to read you the preface to the new edition of this book on suicide. It's a very small book, and the preface it's about 4,000 words. It shouldn't take too long. And then I look forward to Matthew's response, and then any questions you have. And this is a topic that, well, I'm just going to get straight into it. I'm going to try and share my screen, and let's see if this works. I love this. So you can see what I can see, right? Matthew, is that right? You can see? Great.
Yep.
This is the book. Look, there's a nice little frontispiece here from 1562, Life is Death and Death is Life. I wanted more of these in the book, but we had to negotiate. Just to plug the publisher, because they're now doing this in the US, Fitzcarraldo Editions, who are absolutely brilliant. I've been working with them for years, and the books are exquisitely beautiful. So this is the preface. I wrote this in August. When I wrote Notes on Suicide, my aim was simple: to try and open a space for thinking about suicide as a free act, and to expand as far as I could the vocabulary for such thinking. Suicide is a topic that invites strong, indeed panicked and confused reactions. So in order to find a leadway for the kind of space I was imagining, some ground had to be cleared. I'd become increasingly frustrated by the limited and predictable ways in which suicide and suicides were discussed, both in the news and public debate, but also among friends and acquaintances. It seemed to me as if we suffered from a genuine impoverishment of language and compassionately minded, clear thinking on the topic. Even worse, my own ruminations on suicide were mired in the same muddiness and limitation. I decided to try and do something about it in the way I know best, in writing. I've become fascinated in why it was that many people saw suicide as somehow wrong, as the expression of a moral failure, a life somehow gone awry, which gave rise to the most peculiar and powerful reactions of upset outrage, voluble gossip, or quite often an oddly stubborn silence. I began to look into the historical reasons that lie behind the prohibition against suicide. As I read about it more carefully, and that's really where I began, I became increasingly convinced that the moral and legal framing of the prohibition against suicide had its roots in the idea of suicide as a sin. This idea can be traced to medieval Christian theology and metaphysics. specifically the claim that life is a gift from God, which grants us the right of use, but not the right of governance or dominion over our lives. This only really gets formulated in the medieval period. To kill oneself is to assume a power over life that does not lie with us, but only with the deity, however the deity might be conceived. Although arguably only a small fraction of people still hold such Christian metaphysics to be true, maybe not in Boston College, it nonetheless has enduring effects on our moral and legal thinking about suicide, giving rise to extreme and confused reactions. Once the theological history of the prohibition against suicide has been better understood and unravelled, it becomes easy to show how the secular discussion of suicide in terms of rights and duties is often misplaced and conceptually incoherent. This is what I try and do in the longish second part of the essay. I also criticise the libertarian argument for suicide, which turns on questionable assumptions about rationality and autonomy. The idea that suicide is can be a rational choice. What does rationality mean in that context? I'm deeply opposed to any argument that the sovereignty of God, monarch, country, or community should be the basis for a prohibition of suicide. That's indeed how it was for, say, the 17th century in many places. I'm also suspicious of claims to self-sovereignty that support any right to suicide as a simple rational choice or self-evident civic liberty. So much for the polemical part of the essay. I then turn to suicide notes. I could maybe talk at some later on about how this happened, and try and examine them with deliberate coldness as a distinct and compelling literary genre. Not all suicides leave notes, many don't, and their reliability can easily be questioned, given that they often follow quite predictable, indeed stereotypical rhetorical patterns. And yet they're crucial evidence for the extreme mental distress and incontrovertible tunnel vision experienced by the suicidally depressed. They also have a peculiar fascination on the living and have an almost pornographic appeal that draws readers in, myself included. As Kay Redfield Jameson writes, the particulars of suicide hook our imagination in a dark way. I think that's an important thing to remember. This is hardly wholesome, but it is a phenomenon that merits careful attention. For me, the most powerful feature of suicide notes is the way in which they make manifest the extraordinary psychical ambivalence of depressive isolation and extreme exhibitionism, of masochism and sadism, and most importantly, hatred and love. In suicide notes, the most intense self-hatred gives rise to the most radical exclamations of love. I'm doing this, it's the way I tend to write, but beneath that, those of you who, see the world this way will see I'm looking at the idea of drive and vicissitudes of drive in Freud's sense is what's playing out there. Hate, love, masochism, sadism. From there, I look into suicide as a vehicle of revenge, as a way of giving voice to persecutory fantasies of victimization and narcissistic self-justification. Here we confront the disturbing phenomenon of homicide-suicide. In cases like the Sandy Hook Elementary School shooting of 2012, and more particularly the case of Elliot Rodger, who killed himself after killing 6 people in California in 2014, leaving behind a lengthy manifesto and a disturbing video suicide note. Since the time of writing, in 2014, Rodger has become a hero of the incel, involuntary celibate movement, an online subculture of often reactionary and consistently misogynistic young men, which has been behind a significant number of killings since 2014. This is an interesting, disturbing phenomenon. In the final part of the essay, I consider the following question. What if suicide is not the unasked for consequence of a psychopathological condition with a possibly organic basis, but is chosen as a free act, as an end in itself? How might we think about suicide when there is no apparent motivating cause? If such a thing is possible, and it clearly is, then it leads everyone to ask themselves the question, why live? Why live? And here I very consciously move into the area of existential analysis, which is perhaps not surprising since I think of myself as an existential phenomenologist. I love saying that now. I came out fully as an existential phenomenologist quite recently, and I just like saying that. It's a lot of syllables, and but it's true. And the work of worked through a number of examples and texts by authors such as Édouard Lervet, Albert Camus, and Jean Améry. I try and think through the question of why it is that suicide seems so morally rebarbative and face up to what Édouard Lervet calls its scandalous beauty. Homo sapiens is distinguished by the capacity for self-slaughter, which is perhaps the price we pay for self-consciousness, in particular the forms of acute self-consciousness characteristic of some writers, artists, and scientists, or indeed just think of Hamlet, right? It's essential, because Hamlet's first soliloquy deals with the question of suicide, and it's essential to our sense of ourselves, others, and the world that we face up to the experience of finitude that the question of suicide raises. At every single moment we live and breathe, the arms for our self-destruction lie in our hands. I mean, it's an obvious thought, but still, you say it, it lands a certain way. Not that I'm counselling in any way that we take up those arms against ourselves. On the contrary, I finished the essay by leaning on the wonderfully comic pessimism of Cioran, or Cioran, as they might say in Romania, namely his notion that the problem with the suicidally depressed is that they're too optimistic. Nothing will be saved by taking our own lives, and the belief in suicide is the only way out derives from an arrogant overestimation of our capacity for salvation through self-destruction. Therefore, the line of Cioran's reasoning, why not stay a while and enjoy the tender indifference of the world that holds itself out for our attention and our seemingly infinite capacity for disappointment? It's a lovely, strange argument. It doesn't really make it, I'm pulling it out. I end the essay with what we might think of as the pessimist's refutation of suicide. But this is a pessimism of strength, good humor, and hopefully even high spirits. The question of the meaning of life is the wrong question, and I humbly suggest that we stop asking it. Our minds will never stop rummaging through the drawers of self-doubt, self-disgust, and self-pity in order to find some piece of forgotten, dirty, moral laundry. What is important is the ability to get life to stand still and to look at it tenderly and with care, to cultivate slower forms of attention without renouncing life in some sovereign, violent act. One should go on. So that's kind of the summary of it. That's the argument. I don't think I'm necessarily right in my views on suicide, nor do I think that I'm particularly well qualified to give them. What the reader finds in the following essay are impressions based on observation and reading, nothing more. Those looking for real expertise in the psychopathology and neurobiology of suicidal depression can look elsewhere. For example, in the writings of Redfield Jameson, such as Night Falls Fast. Rather, this essay is what I wrote after I took myself off to the Brudenell Hotel in Aldborough on the Suffolk coast in England in November 2014. In retrospect, it seems like a very odd thing to do. In fact, writing during the COVID summer in New York, going anywhere at the moment seems like an odd thing to do. The location now seems more than a little self-dramatizing with all those references to the vast North Sea. I keep talking about the sea. All I can say in my defense is that it didn't at the time. It felt like a logical decision to have been made by someone who was struggling with what we might call the pains of love and a feeling of life's disintegration. This happens, right, as we all know. I won't engage in self-critique here, as it would take far too long and deflect from my purpose in writing this preface. I'm unhappy with the last pages of the essay, which I think moved too quickly towards an upbeat conclusion, and in a way that seems rather insouciant now. I don't think I really resolved the question of how love might be a force that can pull us beyond any desire for self-slaughter, but also drive us into the depths of hatred and despair. I also think that I make heavy weather of the standard arguments around suicide in part 2, and the writing could be crisper and faster. To be brutally honest, I felt a little skewered by one reviewer's questioning of the sincerity of my suicidal ideation. This was a review in the TLS, mainly because it led me to question my own sincerity in writing what I did at the time. What can I say? I was navigating rough waters at the time, but they feel less rough now, and I wonder whether there was a storm at sea at all. I backed off from talking publicly about suicide in recent years, partly because I think I've said what I wanted to say, but more importantly because I'm slightly fearful of the strange, attractive energy that the topic can provoke in audiences. And I worried it was getting too easy to both arouse and incite audiences while increasingly doubting my intentions in the process. The better I got at talking about suicide, the more fraudulent I felt in doing so. At times I had the sense that I was running through a tried, trusted and tired stand-up routine that felt increasingly distant even as I was performing it. That said, I like to think about whether anything has changed with respect to the question of suicide in the years since I wrote this essay. So the essay was written in 2014. The research was done 2012, 13, the previous few years. So has anything changed? Well, there's obviously the vast issue of climate collapse and the fact that we're all engaged in a slow-ish act of collective suicide, like a stoned business executive tottering and teetering atop a high office building. There's the widely reported theme of deaths of despair in the work of Anne Case and Angus Deaton, which compellingly documents the rise in self-destructive and suicidal behaviour, particularly amongst white working class people without a college degree in the USA. It came out a couple of years ago. Or maybe it wasn't even that long. A particular interest, this is what I want to focus on here, is the question of social media and whether there is a relation of causation or at least correlation between social media and a range of behaviours, from mood disorders to self-harm, suicidal ideation and suicide. The question I want to take up now is that question. What's changed in our relationship to suicide? Well, something's changed and it's got something to do with social media. And how do we think about that? I am not a social scientist, and it would be slightly laughable if I presented myself as such. In my initial research for the essay, I carefully gathered a large number of sociological factoids about suicide, which made it into my first draft, but which I then cut because I didn't feel confident about the truthfulness of what I was saying. That's kind of a lie. I cut it because my agent and my editor said it was shit, which it was. So it just didn't work. I had a different beginning. It's very easy to give in to a kind of moral panic around suicide when it's linked to statistics, brightly colored graphs and speculation about new patterns of destructive social behavior. And it's very important not to give in to such panic. This is the stuff of the news cycle. I could talk about the news cycle with respect to suicide recently. I did some, looking at that. Any full understanding of suicide requires, this is a kind of general remark, quite a lot packed into it, but let's see. Any full understanding of suicide requires, at the very least, the cultivation of a much longer and broader view of suicidal behavior across as wide a historical and cultural sweep as possible, along with the richest possible sociological data. It should also be informed by literary analysis, the vast archive of poetry, stories, and movies, songs at our fingertips. It also needs to be particularly sensitive to how suicidal behavior maps onto gender arrangements in various societies, and to try and analyze clearly how suicide affects men and women in very different ways, and in particular, the proclivities towards suicide amongst non-binary and transgender people. Analogous considerations would have to apply to questions of ethnicity and race in relation to suicide. And importantly, a consideration of these questions cannot exclude, and I'm thinking here of an event I did with Kay Redfield Jameson and Andrew Solomon, and it kind of stuck in my mind. I don't talk about it, but I could talk about it if you want. Cannot exclude the question of whether and to what extent suicidal behavior has an organic biological basis. Are suicidal patterns of behavior best explained organically in terms of neurobiology or even serotonin levels? Is suicidality, even, as they say, it's not a nice phrase, a suicidality even an inheritable condition within, say, certain families and communities? Is suicide to be explained through some mixture of nature and nurture, where the precise weight of each side of the scale is very much in the balance? I think these are all legitimate, big questions. And I say, I simply do not know the answers to these questions. And I lack the expertise to make any sort of helpful, informed judgment. As I already said, my approach to suicide is more philosophical, and my inclination is towards existential analyses of the topic. That's the sound of me kind of covering my butt, right, in that paragraph. But things had to be said. This question of the organic in relation to suicide is a question that has to be acknowledged. I don't know what I think about that. I'd be interested to know what you think about that. Yet, the question of social media has me worried, because the early indications from the research are genuinely disturbing. I'd like to lean a little on the ongoing extensive work of Jonathan Haidt and Jean Twenge, which is a tremendously helpful compilation of a number of studies, mainly focused in the English-speaking world. So this is kind of ongoing pair of research papers that I've had access to, huge things, which are pulling together, summarizing literature review of all the studies going on where the authors are able to find these studies into the effects of social media on mood disorder, behavior, depression, and the rest. So they're not finished papers, they're kind of compilations of ongoing research. The research is beginning to show that the effects of social media are serious, far-reaching, and are getting worse. Worse for females than males, and worse still for young females. In response to the question, has there been a significant increase in instances of mood disorders, self-harm, suicidal ideation, and suicide since 2010? Then the answer is yes. The causes here can be social, such as shifts in parenting practices, from absent parents leaving the care of children to nannies or whoever, to helicopter parents who overlook every detail of their children's existence and drown it out with the overbearing noise of their care. I'm sure we've met them. The causes can also be socioeconomic. For example, the effects of the so-called Great Recession, 2007, 2009. But there's no doubt that a prime cause is the rapid and incredibly widespread adoption of smartphones and the spread of social media. There's been a spectacular increase in the occurrence of major depressive episodes, what's called MDEs, in recent years. Although this can be detected across a wide number of age groups, the behavioral effects of social media use on the experience of depression are particularly marked among Gen Z, or what Twenge calls iGen, internet generation, namely those born between roughly 1995 and 2015, who reached adolescence after the adoption of smartphones. According to Haidt and Twenge, although this view has been challenged, if the period from 2000 to 2012 is compared to 2012 onwards, the time when smartphones achieved market saturation, then there's been a really significant rise in a number of behaviors, such as the frequency of suicidal ideations, the levels of suicide attempts, and the number of completed suicides. They claim that the suicide rate for preteen girls has doubled since 2012. If that's true, it's an astonishing statistic. And the rise in suicide rates amongst teenage girls is particularly striking and disturbing. Multiple anecdotes from families and friends and the stories that pepper the news cycle would seem to confirm this trend. Again, the tendency towards moral panic should be avoided. There is simply no denying that something is changing and has changed in how we behave and how we feel. And that is due in large part to the massive use of smartphones. The effects of those changes are particularly and acutely marked among the young, especially young women. We need to pay careful attention to it. It's excessive to speak of a suicide generation among the young, but the increase in everything on the range from mood disorder to completed suicide is not simply random. It is notoriously hard to establish precise relations of causation between new technologies and social behaviors. In this case, between social media and suicide. If such relations of causation were clearly established and became the dominant view, then to put it rather mildly, this would be rather bad news for the business model of the immense social media companies that dominate our lives. Use more Instagram, it kills your kids. There is undisputedly a correlation between social media use and suicidal feelings and behavior. Whether there is a will to actually do something about it at the level of legislation and regulation, at a governmental and transgovernmental level, is quite another matter. That's a question. If you want to pick that up, we could. I mean, is there something that can be done? Well, I think there is. Whether there's a will to do it is another issue entirely. This is the last part. Leaving to one side the empirical data and thinking more at the level of personal feeling and intuition, we know that something is deeply wrong in our relation to social media. We sense it, we see it all the time, we smell it in the air. Regardless of the devastation that they're wreaking on our political institutions and the free flow of opinion apparently so cherished by our formerly liberal democracies. Sound a bit polemical here, don't I? Our formerly liberal democracies, we know that Facebook, Instagram, and the rest negatively affect our well-being. We know that after long periods of distracting, vicarious social media stimulation, our mood deteriorates and we slump into a sleepless, agitated inertia. Passive social media use, PSMU, as it's called in some of the literature, induces fatigue, loneliness, depression, a kind of 17th century Pascalian ennui, and the sense that our lives are inadequate and pointless in comparison to the manufactured glamour, righteous moralized rage, and simple falsehood that stares back at us continually from our tiny screens in an uninterrupted rising flood tide. As Virginia Heffernan rightly puts it, we're all suffering from hyperarousal and hyperlexia. I think this is very suggestive. Hyperarousal, hyperlexia. We read too much, we get too aroused. Reading continuously and allowing ourselves to become incited and excited over and over again before slipping back into exhausted amnesia. It's not just that we're bullied by social media, although many individuals are. It's rather that we allow and want ourselves to be bullied, to be subjected to a kind of passive beating, where everything and everyone are too much, and we watch an endless gallery of the immemorable move past our eyes from our Crusoe-esque peopleless kingdoms of loneliness. I had to argue really hard to keep that sentence in. I wanted it Crusoe-esque peopleless kingdoms of loneliness. I just liked that rhythm, and I really had to. So, we're addicted to social media. And once addicted, everything flows down an algorithmically generated gutter of links into a bottomless rabbit hole of melancholia. The effects of such addiction, isolation, agitation, fear, weird hypochondriac symptoms, insomnia, and Hamlet-like inner spiraling self-doubt. Sound familiar? The depressive inferences of such behavior are not hard to see or to imagine. The implications for suicidal behavior appear plain. especially when our social media habits are combined with increased drug and alcohol dependency. The use of intoxicants here is in no way transgressive or experimental. I'm teaching some 60s kind of anti-psychiatry stuff in another context, but so I'm thinking about that. Use of intoxicants here, R.D. Laing in particular is kind of a hero of mine. A simply way of getting through, of buttressing a dead routine. Many of us feel like shit quite a lot of the time. Oddly, we seem to like it, or behave in ways that make it worse. What is going on? All of these tendencies have been accelerated and exaggerated by the COVID-19 pandemic. The gangplanks of social interaction, shared ways of life, and actual human contact that we took for granted have been pulled away. Other people are possible sources of contagion, and so are we. We advance masked and keep our distance. The pandemic has left us more reliant upon and exposed to the pervasive presence of digital existence. To use the ghastly lingo, COVID-19 feels like one long MDE exacerbated by PSMU, mentally passive social media. As for the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic on the varieties of mental harm and eventually on the suicide rate, it is far too soon to know anything with certainty. Talk about this if you want. But I doubt the news will be good. It is well known that the most common season for suicide is spring, when everything would appear to be returning to life. And the most popular day of the week for suicide is Monday, when people resume the effort of labour. So the consequence of COVID-19 on suicide will not be felt until the situation significantly improves. So we have that to look forward to. Indeed, there is evidence that situations like a pandemic with self-isolation and lockdowns are marginally better for people prone to depression. The thought here is that it's easier to deal with one's own depression when everyone else is miserable too. There is a solace in collective self-isolation for the melancholic temperament. Counting myself among their number, a little bit melancholic, I must confess that I rather enjoyed lockdown, quarantine and the rest. And I'm already rather nostalgic for its apparent austerities, which seem to be coming back. In which case, it is the much vaunted return to normal that should be the cause for concern, the shared post-pandemic springtime. And we should be cognizant of the contagious effects of suicide, which are well documented, and the fact that the prevention efforts can also have the opposite effect of triggering the act. How this is all going to play out, it is too soon to tell. As Philip Larkin said of the reality of old age and decrepitude, we shall find out. You know, the poem The Old Fools by Larkin. I believe that some of the stigma surrounding mental illness has been diminished in the years since I wrote this essay, 2014. Even professional football players, soccer players, are talking about depression these days. We're now perhaps more inclined to talk about suicide than we used to be. At least I hope this is the case. A large element of the motivation for writing this book was to widen the vocabulary around suicide, to find more words to describe and understand the phenomenon and treat it with empathy rather than empty platitudes. What are we talking about when we talk about suicide? Something I repeatedly encountered after I wrote the essay and was asked to talk about suicide was a simple conceptual inadequacy. In many ways, the problem with suicide, this is a serious point, is that we stretch just one concept to fit across a wide range of behaviors. The decision to end one's life in old age as a consequence of a terminal illness and intolerable physical suffering, say, is a very different matter from a sudden violent act in a moment of manic exuberance. The self-slaughter of a betrayed lover is very different from the carefully planned insanity of a suicide bomber. Suicide is a little like God. If someone asks me, do you believe in God? I'm always inclined to reply, which one? There are so many. At the very least, we need a range of more subtle and various concepts to describe the phenomena lumped together under the heading of suicide. We're at the end now almost. In The Noonday Demon, Andrew Solomon has very helpfully begun this work by introducing 4 categories of suicide. 1, a manic, dire, impulsive and sudden act. 2, revenge or self-obliteration as payback for a felt wound. 3, suicides which are planned with complex and often lengthy notes, seemingly pragmatic, but with a deeply faulty logic, as though they were organizing a holiday in outer space, as Solomon writes. This is something you find in suicide notes, the extent of planning, crazy planning. And 4, those planned through reasonable logic because of physical illness, mental instability, or some catastrophic change in life's circumstances. To be clear, those people included under 4 might be mistaken in their view. In particular, the consequences that their action might have on their nearest and dearest. But we cannot say that they're deluded. Right? So under 4, let's say a parent who becomes terminally ill and decides to end their life. You can say, well, that person might be mistaken because they need to think more, perhaps. It's arguable about the consequences, but you can't say they're deluded. Solomon's categories are a beginning, it seems to me. But we need to add more categories, such as the forms of suicide, homicide, discussed in my essay, or which I think is just it's not that it's new, but it's accelerated. Right? The idea that the way in which you can choose to kill yourself is through a homicidal act, which might end with you killing yourself, or it might end with you being killed by the police. There's the idea of suicide by cop, which has been around for quite a long time. But there's also a sense in which the phenomenon of the suicide bomber, which is maybe faded from attention in the last months for obvious reasons, is demands another category, another term. Or I think this is also important, the apparently inadvertent deaths that occur increasingly through fatal mixtures of drugs and alcohol, where the question of intention is very hard to pin down, right? Did Prince kill himself? Well, so fentanyl-related death, let's say. How do you really judge intention in that? Such a list of categories could be extended. The important thing is for this work of reflection to continue and to move steadfastly away from any simple-minded idea of suicide as something one must either be for or against, defend or oppose. It is infinitely more subtle than that. It's unclear whether suicide is unique to human beings. Another big question. I have no difficulty in imagining an octopus killing itself, and indeed there's evidence for that. But there's nothing more human than suicide. Human beings are complex creatures. I see no reason why the discussion of the ways in which we sometimes choose to end our lives should be deprived of the same complexity. That is that. And then the book kind of starts.
So I've just unmuted myself. Thank you very much. Just before I begin my response, I was very taken by the kind of empathetic approach that you're introducing here to this topic, and very needed. And so I'll begin. There's no greater compliment you can give a writer than to say, your work has helped me better understand my life. Reading Simon's notes on suicide in anticipation of tonight's lecture has done that for me. It will often happen that a book exists for a while without you knowing about it, but finds you at the exact moment you need it. Actually, I've had this happen to me many times. Years when you seem to need it most in your life. Right now, I'm not struggling with suicidal ideation. I have had bouts with depression in the past. But recently, I have been subject to a series of anxiety attacks, They strike in the middle of the night, waking me from sleep and keeping me awake with a squeezing, wrenching tightness in my chest, a suffocating breathlessness, and of course, the incessant thought that I'm about to die. And I bring this up not to worry my parents who are sitting at home watching this, but because as I read through Simon's book, I couldn't help but to see a connection between the underlying conditions of anxiety and those of suicide. Both, I would argue, are fundamentally concerned with the problem of meaning, each revealing a different aspect of that problem. Now, before I begin, I should note a couple of things. First, like Simon said, he was covering his own ass by saying this. I will take the opportunity to do the same thing. I'm approaching this topic from a philosophical, existential lens and do not claim to be offering a psychological or biological or sociological explanation. Second, in taking up the question of meaning and its relation to anxiety and suicide, I am explicitly disregarding Simon's request. As we heard him read in his preface, he says, meaning is the wrong question, and he would humbly ask it's humbly suggest that we stop asking it. And that admittedly puts me in a bit of an awkward position, sitting as I am across the screen from Simon and no one else. So I hope, Simon, that you'll forgive me for taking up this question, for blatantly refusing to abide by your wishes. And I won't be arrogant enough to suggest that you may ultimately find the slight worthwhile. Okay. With that out of the way, I want to begin my response where Simon begins, with a purely descriptive examination of suicide, one freed from the bonds of stigma, morality, and religious prohibition. I want to consider the many examples that Simon brings up. So he did a good job pointing out how all of these different types of suicide are very different from one another. Suicide as a consequence of terminal illness, terminal diagnosis, or as the consequence of the loss of love, or a feeling of isolation and alienation from others. A lot of us are facing that right now or have been through the pandemic, or in the service of a political ideology or a religious cause. I want to take a look at these different, very various forms of suicide, and I want to ask what, if anything, ties these very different acts together. Is there something beyond their end, the death that results, that unites them? I was reminded, as I considered Simon's examples, of a footnote from Camus' The Myth of Sisyphus, and of course, obviously, this work is, in many ways in the background of some of what you're doing here. Camus, in a footnote, he writes, I've heard of a post-war writer who, after having finished his first book, committed suicide to attract attention to his work. Attention was, in fact, attracted, but the book was judged no good. Snarky remark by Camus. It always stood out to me. Anyone who can weave humor into a philosophical discourse is doing something very valuable. So that's always kind of when I read that book. For me, what really I want to emphasize in this anecdote is that the post-war writer's first book was also his last. Once he had finished writing it, he had nothing left to do. He could only kill himself. Now, as a writer myself, I can empathize with this situation. Every time I finish a work, I feel horribly depressed. You just have to ask my wife. If I'm not writing something, I'm in complete shambles. This happens every time I complete something that I've been working on. In fact, the worst thing for me is to complete a project I've been working on for years. So long as the task remains before me, unfinished, indefinite, waiting in the indeterminacy of the future, there's hope, there's possibility, there's life. A task accomplished, however, is a dead thing. And when one has tied all of one's meaning to that task, it is hard to go on living. My strategy now is to have too many projects on my plate all at once and never be able to complete any of them, so that at least if I'm always pivoting from thing to thing, I don't fall into this kind of melancholic state. Don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to say that everyone who struggles with suicidal ideation does so because he or she has achieved his or her life's goal. But I am suggesting that the thoughts of suicide creep in when one feels that one's life has become defined, that it has a set meaning, a single meaning, and that nothing unexpected or new might break in upon it and change its direction. Consider the much commented upon rise of self-destructive tendencies among white middle-class Americans. This is a common topic. It comes up in my classes a lot. This is something that we're all aware of. By one reading, this could be attributed to the fact that a lot of people feel that they're not living meaningful lives. But by another, it might be said that these people's lives are too meaningful, confined to a single meaning, say as an office worker, and that there is nothing ahead of them, no possibility of change, no future. Now think of the examples we mentioned above. The recipient of a terminal diagnosis sees no future. His fate defines him. The woman who has been abandoned by her lover knows that love can be no more. The lonely and isolated are trapped in their solitude. They are walled up by themselves with no exit. The religious or political fanatic has discovered the meaning of life and so sacrifices himself and often others to it. Suicide, Simon aptly writes, abolishes the future. But it is my contention that the person who commits suicide does so because his or her future has already been abolished. It has been negated by the meaning of the present, a meaning accomplished and yet which cannot be done away with, a meaning which defines him and thus shuts down the possibility that any other meaning might arise. Simon's answer to this problem, it seems to me, is to open oneself to the meaninglessness of existence. Again, I think we hear resonances with Camus, of Camus. He suggests we stop trying to define life, give up the futile, though admittedly human attempt to nail the damn thing down. The worst thing we could do, his book seems to suggest, is get what we want and find that there's nothing left to be done, no future to pursue. He ends with a beautiful meditation on what it means to open ourselves to the gentle indifference of the world and to do so tenderly with love. And he concludes, I quote, "It is enough." I want to believe that that is true. I really do. And yet my recent bouts of anxiety have left me shaken. For when in the clutches of an anxiety attack, it is precisely the indifference and indeterminacy of the world that fills one with terror. It is the overwhelming meaninglessness of existence, the fact that one has too many possibilities, and that any of them or none of them might come to fruition, that leaves one breathless. Kierkegaard, in an underappreciated work called The Concept of Anxiety, defines anxiety as, I quote, freedom's actuality of the possibility of possibility. And when I was preparing to give this, I asked myself, why did I include that quote? That's a very confusing quote to bring in here. But what I think Kierkegaard means by that is that anxiety is my awareness of my own freedom, my recognition of the fact that I live as a free being with an infinite number of possibilities before me, so many possibilities that they overwhelm me and I drown in my own freedom. Simon, in his talk, notes that suicides come often in the spring when life is returning, right? So at this moment when there's newness and possibility arising, and I think that's a really interesting fact. Given this experience, given the unbearable weight of indeterminacy, or as Milan Kundera would have it, the unbearable lightness of being, one would choose any meaning, even an awful one, even perhaps death, over meaninglessness, possibility, and freedom. And here I have in mind something like Ivan Karamazov's The Grand Inquisitor in The Brothers Karamazov, that we don't want our freedom, that we want to escape it at all costs. That is why I think when suffering an anxiety attack, one's thoughts go to death immediately. That's the thing that fills your head. And it does so, I think, because death is both the final possibility and the end of all possibilities. The thing you dread, but also the thing that could alleviate this anxiety, that could relieve you of this problem. And yet, as Simon so beautifully shows, if we hang on a while, if we endure it, life does go on. In the tension between anxiety and suicide, infinite, stifling possibility, and finite meaning, which closes off possibility forever, life does go on. It is learning to live with the tension. It's learning to bear the burden. And it can be done. Each of us is already doing it right now. Those are my comments. And I would, I don't know, if you'd like to dialogue on that for a minute before we open up to questions, I'd be eager to hear anything else.
You, myself. Yeah, thank you very much for that, Matthew. Firstly, in thinking about the question of suicide, my method, I don't believe in method, is taken from Jean Améry, 2 words, introspection and empathy. And that's kind of how I do a lot of empathy. So in relation to meaning, as I was listening to you, I was thinking, what is going on here? And I think what's going on is that, how would I put this? And I disagree with you in terms of writing. I always, when I finish things, I'm very happy because I've emptied my head of all that stuff and I can fill it with something else and then do something else. So I feel an enormous sense of relief. Oh, that's done. I'm then quite happy in a way. The question of meaning, well, if I think back as to why I'm saying what I'm saying there, a long time ago, I wrote in the 1990s, I wrote this book called Very Little, Almost Nothing. And it was a very personal book. It was done in a kind of scholarly way, but it was very personal. It was about, my father's death, amongst other things. And I was, there are different things at play, but a lot of it's about Beckett. And Beckett for me has been a lifeline throughout my life. And, I feel like about meaning the way someone would, if someone would ask Beckett about, what does it mean? What is the meaning of it? Or when, in Godot, when someone's saying, Vladimir saying to Estragon, whatever, when this, when what, time, why do you keep cursing me with time? I don't know. Why do you keep cursing me with meaning? Why do things have to mean something? So there's an idea that I'm quite attached to of trying to get rid of the question of meaning and to see meaninglessness as an achievement. It's the formulation I used a long time ago. I hadn't thought about this for ages. So thank you for allowing me to think about it. And there's two formulations that I kept coming back to in relation to Beckett specifically. Meaninglessness as an achievement of the ordinary, and it's the ordinary which interests me, right? Because that's where I am, that's where we are, ordinary life. And we need to be redeemed from redemption. So the problem with meaning is that meaning is always too redemptive. And that redemption discourse, I think, is often the worst kind of punishment that human beings can come up with for themselves. A bit like hope. I think hope is a terrible concept, and I've attacked it on different occasions. I think, in comes hope to tickle your feet, Anne Carson says, to realize, to find out that the souls are on fire. And I think that hope is, a terrible burden that ends up punishing and extending agony. So there I'm with a different cast of characters. Beckett, a certain slice of Nietzsche, I think is very important to me. Not the kind of critical, analytical Nietzsche, not the guy eating cream cakes on the Mediterranean so much. And I think also there's a difference with anxiety as well. I think that anxiety is, very important, and but I'm also strongly attracted to, because anxiety is about possibility. So the Kierkegaard quote is bang on, it's accurate. Because anxiety is the way in which possibility emerges and becomes more possible. So anxiety is the anxiety of freedom, right? So that's Kierkegaard, and that's what Heidegger picks up on, and it's powerful, powerful stuff. But I'm suspicious of it. I think, I remember, so another kind of, hero of mine is Emmanuel Levinas. And Levinas published a book in 1948, which was translated as Existence and Existence, but, really is from existence to the existent, de l'existence à l'existant. And that book, as is the case in France, it had little red bands around the book in the bookshop, right, giving kind of what it was about, or an author photo. And Levinas chose, it wasn't with a great publisher, he got rejected by the publishers he wanted to be published by. That was his problem, big problem for him. But the band around the cover said, Existence and Existence, où il ne s'agit pas de l'angoisse, where it is not a question of anxiety, right? It's not a question of anxiety. So for Levinas, stronger than anxiety is something like the horror of being attached to oneself, being riveted to existence. And it's that feeling of being riveted to existence, to your own existence, that is the fundamental mood, rather than anxiety as possibility. And then you end up with a very different kind of phenomenology if you go along that. So that's kind of why I'm going along those lines. I hadn't thought about that, so thank you for dredging that up. It's very helpful. And of course, the end, the it is enough. I finished the book with, like I said, I'm not happy with the moves I make in the last few pages. I think it goes a bit quickly, but I end up with Virginia Woolf. And Virginia Woolf's description of Mrs. Ramsay into the lighthouse, and Mrs. Ramsay saying, "It is enough." And she's describing the very ordinary interior of the room at night, and the way the light falls across the floor, and the children are asleep, and she's observing what's around her, and it is enough. Life stands still here. And of course, in the case of Woolf, that things ended differently for reasons which we all know. The suicide of Virginia Woolf, and which was bound up with the terror that she had of an oncoming mania, right? And the fact that she couldn't bear that again, and couldn't bear punishing her husband with that again. And So that's some things that I'd say in response to what you were saying. But thank you for saying it. And
Yeah, thank you. If I might, before I turn to questions, I'll just, I guess by the end of my response, one of the things that I was thinking was, I may have set it up a little polemically. I think ultimately, though, that I agree with where you end up. But for me, and what I'm trying to articulate is, I think that the "it is enough" really is situated between the kind of the poles of anxiety and suicide, or meaning and meaninglessness, kind of in that tension, in that space that exists between those things. There is the possibility of actually appreciating things as they are, which I think is more what you're saying. I mean, I had Camus very much in mind with his emphasis on kind of grasping the meaninglessness or something. But I think that's very much kind of where you're ending up, which is that instead of going toward, one of those poles which ultimately collapse into one another, living in the tension between the two is where we have to find life and where it comes back to.
Yeah, except I'm more suspicious. I mean, I'm much more down on Camus than you. I mean, I think Camus is great, but I don't buy the absurdity, and I don't buy the diagnosis, and I don't buy the we must go on. I think the way in which people like Améry and Choran poke fun at Camus is good. Although I'm not. He's really important. I'm not saying don't read Camus. It's really important for me. But yeah. So how do we deal with the questions?
We have a few here, and if anyone else wants to put more questions in, please feel free. Yeah. So the most recent one, and I'm just kind of going here. Could Simon speak about guilt and melancholia in the context of suicide?
Well, should we start that's the last one, right? Should we deal with the first one? I've got one from Rivers Fleming here.
Yes.
Because
you see them too. Good.
Yeah. Capital, no, I'm not a capital guy. I've always been kind of quietly at war with academic Marxism, because I come from a much more crappy kind of low-level anarchist background, and the Marxists were always trouble. So I won't drag that into. But capital, no. I think for me it's much more. Sure, it's part of the story. Technologies, yes, of course, it's very, very important what Rivers is saying. But I think what's going on in let's say the question of social media, technology, capital, yes, but we have to think also about the way in which narcissism plays out in relationship to, say, smartphones, and whether, I'm putting this rather crudely, I mean, I'm a Rousseauist, right? I'm a Rousseauian, in the sense in which the engine of inequality, the engine of what Marx would diagnose, let's say, as the inequality of a capitalist society, has to be traced back to narcissism, comparison, the act of comparison, and that moment when one human being sees another human being at the waterhole and perhaps feels an interest and attraction, that other human being that's there, and also comparison. And it's that comparison that's the engine, I think, of, that's Rousseau's got, the engine of inequality is really narcissism. And I think what social media is about, in a very powerful way, is about comparison, the force of comparison. Here am I, and I'm looking at this life, and this life looks a lot better than my life. And then that makes me feel terrible. And then I put a little bit of my life out there, and I'm not saying but let's say if I'm a 14-year-old, a young woman, and I put a bit of my life out there and think, well, okay, that I look quite nice in that. This is a nice photograph. and it gets savaged and attacked and bullied and torn down, and then that causes incredible suffering in that young. And that's sometimes what's happening with these social media related fatalities. That's a kind of something about a mechanism of comparison and narcissism, which is has to be added to what Rivers is saying. So it's not that Rivers is wrong. We need more than that.
While you're on the topic of social media, you had mentioned at the beginning of the talk that you thought that there were some things that could be done to kind of address the ills that social media and the smartphones are kind of cropping up in our lives, but you didn't think we had the stomach for it. I was curious, before we move on, if you could touch on that for a minute. I was interested in what you had to say.
Well, I mean, the simplest thing is, what the EU tried to do with, data protection and the digital legislation that was introduced a couple of years ago, which certainly got the attention of the huge media companies. You could say that's it's after the horse has bolted or left the stable, or what the metaphor is. It's too late. But and there, the kind of driving concern was more the kind of concern with privacy. There are search engines, which I have, like Quant, where you don't, your search history is not used is not sold, is not harvested, it's not part of some, surveillance project. So there are ways. So there is let's call it the European model, the EU model, but in the US there seems to be no taste for that. And think about the public relations disasters that Facebook alone has been through in the last few years. And has it affected their bottom line? No, not at all. Actually, not that many people have left Facebook. They're making more money than ever. And it's so what do we really want? And could we then, we could, if we wanted to, exercise more control, but I see no political will to do that. And it is kind of, without wanting to be vulgar, it's screwing the world. It really is. I really think that, I'm completely inside it. I mean, I'm as addicted to these things as everybody else. I really think it's a mechanism of inflammation. And you mentioned that Todd Dubow's interesting. I can't read and speak at the same time. Can't do two things at once. But you mentioned Mary Midgley. I love Mary Midgley. Thank you for mentioning Mary Midgley.
I'll actually read a bit of the question just because we're recording it for people who wouldn't
okay.
Otherwise see it.
Oh, so people can't see it?
Yeah.
Okay. And the Todd ends by saying, I'm thinking of the recent documentary Social Dilemma. Yeah, true. It's good. Tristan Harris is someone who's got a line on what's going on as an insider, who's become a kind of, the sense of a humane technology and all of that stuff. Very important. So yeah. What's next? Sarah Carney. Is that the Sarah Carney? I can't get responses from out there. Oh, hello. Oh yeah, the Carney household. Good Lord, yeah, these are friends of mine. And so Sarah asks, can you speak more about your experience reading suicide notes and what kind of reasons, patterns, or passing words people shared, and how this might have shaped or offered insight into your understanding of the diverse reasons for suicide? And I do lots of absurd things, right? Because I've probably got too much time on my hands. So one thing that I have a friend who's now left town, who's called Sina Najafi, who used to run a magazine called Cabinet, still runs a magazine called Cabinet, but he's now moved to Berlin. And me and Sina we did this, I was so upset with the School of Life and Alain de Bosson and all that stuff that I said to Sina one night in a bar, let's do a School of Death. Ha ha ha. And then we got asked gallery in Chelsea said, you know, we've got a slot coming up for a show, but it's in 3 weeks' time. Can you do it? So we said, yeah, we'll do a School of Death. And we just did it. And we put up it was a tiny room. We put up a blackboard with a little school. And then we had a couple of events there. And I thought it would be a great thing to have a suicide note creative writing workshop. Because another thing I don't really like is creative writing. The separate topic, but I thought this would be good. And then a journalist turned up, and it became a story. And I tell the story in the book. And this led to the one time I actually made it into the tabloid press in the UK, and I was so proud. The story became, you know, it then became kind of New York prof teaching kids how to die for money became the story. And I wasn't paid to do this. It was, and it got picked up by the Daily Mail. I despised the Daily Mail. And there's a version of this story. And then the comment section was, you know, this man should be sacked, Daily Mail. And I thought, yes, finally made it, denounced by the Daily Mail. So that was, and Suicide Notes, I read this book called All Not to Be, which is a collection of suicide notes, and then I began to collect them and then think about them. And think about them as a literary genre, and to see what we can find in suicide notes. And what you find is this extraordinary ambivalence, right? A profound self-hatred, immense guilt, shame, you know, all those things. We need to separate those concepts, but let's just bundle them together. And then often the most extreme expressions of love at the same time. And, you know, I was thinking of the suicide note of Kurt Cobain, which is exactly that, you know, I'm too much of a moody baby, he says, you know, I hate myself, I'm terrible, you know, why, you know, better to, what is it, than fade away, better to
burn out
than fade away, you know. Then he says, I love you, or I love, 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 love. The original, if you see the original text of that, it's just full of these exclamations of love. So suicide notes are these sites for extraordinary ambivalence. And I found that really interesting with my kind of Freud hat on. And then I thought I'd write about it. And then that developed into the suicide homicide idea, where in a sense the suicide note, in the case of Elliot Rodger that I talked about in the talk, I talk about more in the book, where you get this suicide note which becomes an act of homicidal vengeance, which is then perpetrated, and then he killed himself, and the way that has fed into the incel movement and things like that. And I want to just think about those things, because they're not that they're nice things to think about. But thank you, Sarah. I hope everyone is well in Carney World. What's next?
Simon speak about guilt and melancholy in the context of suicide?
Yeah, well, yeah. So the structure of melancholia is the structure of suicidal depression, right? Or you can map those things. So if you think about, obviously I'm not Freudian, but I'm a little bit Freudian. Mourning and Melancholia is for me a powerful kind of basic text. And what Freud picks out of melancholia is that ambivalence, is that Hamlet-like ambivalence, that ability to distance the self, to distance itself from itself in the act of being itself, and to soliloquize and separate. And that division in the self, that wound, narcissistic wound in the self, is melancholia. And suicidal ideation kind of, percolates in that incredibly strongly. So it's yeah, it's powerful. And the sense of guilt, again, just thinking about suicide notes it's incredibly common. And I've got more to say about guilt. I don't think guilt is, but guilt is, in terms of just descriptively, in terms of the phenomenon of suicidal depression, yeah. And what you said, Matthew, also about the anxiety attacks, I think there's, we're the last 6 months, I mean, whatever we think about it, but if we are existential phenomenologists, as you and I both appear to be, and the good people in this virtual room, many of them are too, it's a great time to be an existential phenomenologist, because there's a the kind the sensitivity to moods, to feelings, to that weird interconnection of the mental and the physical, that we live through day to day, and that we feel, all of us, in a pandemic, is, for me, it just shows the enduring power of certain existential approaches. So yeah, I am, and hopefully it's just got rid of some of the, hopefully it's got rid of influences forever, and it's got rid of certain kinds of upbeat nausea. Because what people get wrong, and why Beckett for me is so important. I didn't mention this before, because what I said about Beckett sounds like a bit of a downer, but I think Beckett is the funniest writer in the world. Beckett is an antidepressant for me. So if I'm feeling sad, I'll read Beckett and it cheers me up. And it's lines like when Moran and second half of Malloy, and this character called Gabba is saying to Moran, he says, Gabba says to Moran, life is a thing of beauty. Life is a thing of beauty, Moran, and a joy forever, Moran. A thing of beauty and a joy forever. He paused. I said, do you think he meant human life? And that's a Beckett gag, and it's that bathos which is needed. If we believe in meaning too much, things end up either kind of being too upbeat or too. I'll forget what I was going to say. Scrub that. I'm getting fatigued. What's next?
Our last question.
All right. I better make this a good answer then.
All right.
I'm going to read it out and I can think about it.
Simon takes pleasure in the multi-syllabic identity of existential phenomenologist, and I would like to tempt Simon with a longer identity, existential phenomenological contextualist.
Oh, yeah.
In this regard, I appreciate the way Simon broadly contextualizes suicide, calling for more nuance in our categories and language, distinguishing for suicide that seems to derive from major depressive syndromes, the revenge of the lover, the deliberate response to chronic pain and terminal illness and suffering, etc. As to context, I would question whether Matthew may existentialize a meaninglessness and unimportance in personal emotional experience that may derive from a history of one's subjectivity being treated by others as of no importance, i.e. neglect possible context of early emotional trauma, and thereby conflate the latter with an indifferent universe, perception of which may entail a peculiar enjoyment and an a priori meaninglessness in the world if felt in a context of relationally facilitated self-worth.
All right.
So it seems that question is...
Right, question to you, Sue.
Yeah, it's a question to both of us, I think. I'll let you respond first.
All right, okay. In the first bit, existential phenomenological contextualist, yes. I was teaching yesterday William James, essays on radical empiricism, and And, I'm a kind of, radical empiricism strikes me as a completely sympathetic worldview. And I was also reading the second paragraph of Varieties of Religious Experience by James, where he says, my belief is that a large acquaintance with particulars often makes us wiser than the possession of abstract formulas, however deep. And that, in many ways, is my philosophical credo. A large acquaintance with particulars makes us wiser than the possession of abstract formulas, however deep. And that leads to a kind of peculiar, an apparently peculiar understanding of the philosophical task, which is to contextualize, historicize, make things particular, provide details, take people back always to ordinary life, to ordinary things, to little stuff, the stuff that surrounds us, that clutters things up, and to avoid, as far as possible, apparently profound abstractions. So in a sense, for me, because obviously on one view, philosophy is the most abstract of intellectual activities. I see the philosophical task as exactly the opposite. It's about diagnosing abstraction and trying to return us to the conditions of concrete, particular life, right? And that's incredibly hard because people want abstraction. They want to live in abstractions. Abstractions like, the American people at the moment, what the American people want. And you listen to, say, the VP debate last week, and I don't think the American people want that. Oh, the American people wouldn't agree. This is an abstraction. It's a fantasy. We know that. So let's go back to the rough ground, right? As Wittgenstein would say, go back to the rough ground, and that would be a start. So the way in which I think philosophy has to be done is by continually refusing the need for metaphysics and abstraction that people seem to need to have, and to return it to the ordinary, the low, the humble, the common. And that's, and of course, in the great thing about the American tradition, however it's understood, is there's an extraordinary availability of that, from the transcendentalists through Melville, Whitman, through to James. So this is available.
So Peter, I would just to follow up on what, oh, sorry, Simon, did I cut you off there? Just to follow up on what Simon's saying, first, thank you for your question. I think it's an excellent one. And I'll make it quick because I'm getting my little exit stage right notification. But what I would say is that for me, human life is this thing where we live in the tension between meaning and meaninglessness. So we desire meaning, we want it. But at the same time, and I think that Simon is completely right on this point, that's part of the problem, to always need an abstract meaning, some final purpose or cause for our lives. And so to some degree, one option of how to deal with that is to say, well, embrace the meaninglessness of things. My point tonight was that there's a difficulty with that too. And the difficulty is that the meaninglessness leads to an overwhelming amount of possibility, which also is suffocating. So in order to exist as human beings and really actually return, as Simon's saying, to the concrete, to the lived particular, to my experience, is to find a way to deal with the desire for meaning that I have, but that ultimately would be problematic if I got it, and the meaninglessness that seems to overwhelm me, and to find a way to actually live in the tension of those two things. I mean, for me, much of my life I experienced as a tension, being kind of caught in the middle of things. And I think that I take that to be the ultimate task, is to figure out how to just deal with that and live in the midst of that. And actually, I think that by and large, people do it. I mean, I always look to people who I admire who do that, who live in these awful, tough, grinding situations, and they carry on. And so I think there's a lot of inspiration to be gained by that. That's kind of how I would, what I was trying, the themes I was trying to pull out tonight.
And that was
But
very,
anyways,
very, very nicely formulated. And I think
thank you, Simon.
you should have the last word. And thank you for hosting me on this, and it's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much. It's an incredible honor to have you. Honestly, I cannot encourage people to pick up this book more. It is so beautifully written and will very much be meaningful for your lives, even if we're letting that question go. And I would also encourage you to just remember that there will be more of these lectures over the course of the year. Please stay tuned to the Psychological Humanities and Ethics lecture series. I'll conclude by thanking some of the people who helped bring this together. Of course, David Goodman,
Yes, yeah,
obviously.
David, yeah, absolutely, yeah.
And then Lillian and Mookie, who have been my two helpers here tonight. I am not as technologically savvy as I probably should be, so they've really been steering the ship behind the scenes here. So thank you so much to them. And
Thank you.
everyone involved in Lynch and the PCE team. We really appreciate it. And we appreciate you being here and joining us tonight. And Simon, thank you again. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you. I can't see you, but I can feel that you're there. And you know, thank you for listening to what I had to say, and good luck. Okay.